Hello and welcome everyone to my Poison Animate Weapon Guide. Animate weapons are temporary minions with a long duration that are comparable to permanent minions in most regards, with the exception of area changes which will despawn them. In general, the build has great single target damage, is easy and flexible to level, although I would recommend people to use an auxiliary minion like Skeletons with Infernal Legion or Absolution until we get Unleash in Act 4. In case you're wondering what the leveling experience looks like, I've made a showcase of the leveling process at the beginning of the last league, and I'm of course going to leave the link to that video in the comments below. In general, the build is great to league start, but also scales reasonably well into endgame if you invest enough currency into it. In terms of gear, I recommend people getting Severed in Sleep as soon as possible. This is because it gives our minions a high chance to poison, and also scales reasonably well into the late game, because we can upgrade it into our Abyss weapon, United in Dream, using HAULA's Blessing. Other noteworthy items are the Skin of the Loyal, which gives us +1 level of socketed gems, and 100% increased global defenses, which comes in handy because we are hybrid, in order to increase our effective hit pool early on. For the same reason, we're also using Sorrow of the Divine, which applies the life recovery from flasks to energy shield, which helps topping off our character in dangerous situations. I'm also using Gravebind on my character directly for two reasons. First of all, it allows us to use this Chaos Cluster, which gives us access to unspeakable gifts, which represents a low-cost exploding mechanic for our build. In order to get this specific cluster layout, we need a Chaos Cluster with unspeakable gifts and either Touch of Cruelty, Unwavering Evil, or Overwhelming Malice. The other reason we're using Gravebind on our character is to get access to recovery on kill mechanics such as Vampirism and Soul Thief, which allows our character to be topped off at all times. Outside of that, the Atlas passive tree is pretty much cookie cutter, so investing into Minion, into Live Nodes, and of course into Aura Nodes. In terms of Ascendancy passives, we're getting ourselves Commander of Darkness, Mindless Aggression, Unnatural Strength, and Mistress of Sacrifice. Once you get Mistress of Sacrifice, you also want to switch from Flesh Offering to Bone Offering in order to boost your defenses. For our skills, we're using a bossing and a mapping setup. In the mapping setup, we replace Multi-Strike and Predator support with Melee Splash and Unleash because it helps us clear our maps a little bit faster. In case you're wondering, we're using Withering Touch on Animate Weapon directly because this allows us to have the maximum amount of Withering stacks up at all times. It also alleviates some of the socket pressure we would otherwise have if we were to put it on, let's say, the Carrion Golem instead. We're using Bladefall, linked with Hextouch and Despair to create lingering blades that we need to animate weapons and to curse enemies with Despair. As I mentioned earlier, our Carrion Golem is our golem of choice because it boosts the damage of our animate weapons. For our utility minions, we're using Animate Guardian, Ray Spectre, linked to Minion Life and Summon Phantasms. The Phantasms are sacrificial minions that help us keep our minions topped off at all times, utilizing either this cluster notable or the respective minion mastery, in case you don't have a cluster just yet. Outside of that, we're obviously using Desecrate and a movement skill. Personally, I like using Flame Dash, but you can use other movement skills as well. We're using Bone Offering, Molten Shell, pretty self-explanatory. In addition to that, we're also using some defensive auras to increase our survivability. For Animate Guardian, we're using a couple of cheap uniques, such as Relentless Fury, which gives him Culling Strike, Leocast, which gives our minions increased damage, Softborn, which increases survivability, Wake of Destruction, which makes the Guardian drop Shock Ground while moving, And then the tried and tested Zen Deathless Cassock and Broken Faith combination, which allows our Guardian to create Profane Ground while blocking. In case you don't know it, Profane Ground gives 1% flat crit and lowers all resistances of enemies affected by it by 10%. For our Spectres, we're using the Carnage Chieftain, an Arena Master, and a Pale Seraphim. You can get the Arena Master from Rock's influenced maps and the Pale Seraphim from Beyond. Or you could just join Global Channel 666 and ask if someone can give you a hand who already has these Spectres. And this is pretty much it for the League starter. For the endgame version, there are two notable changes that you have to keep in mind. First of all, we switched to CI. There are two reasons for that. First of all, not having to deal with chaos damage at all is a huge boon in general. And the other reason is that this alleviates modifier pressure that is otherwise hard to work around, because of the changes that were made to certain items, the introduction of the bone rings, the changes made to the minion shields. We're kind of already maxed out in terms of the amount of modifiers we can get on our gear. So not having to worry about chaos resistance makes a lot of sense. And besides that, scaling just one defensive mechanic, in this case energy shield, makes a lot of sense too. The other thing is that we're no longer mainly focusing on poison damage. The reason for that is that there is a dot limit in the game, so there's a maximum amount of damage you can deal using a single source of damage over time, in this case poison. This limit is around 36 million, and you will probably reach that once you invest, let's say, 50 to 100 divines into your build, and can currently not be mitigated in any form or shape. So once you're getting close to that amount of dot DPS, you need to reorient your build and focus on the hit-based component instead. One way of doing that is to forego the Unbound Ailments support gem. The other one is investment into things like crit, for example, right? So we can now start speccing into this minion crit wheel, whereas in the early version this didn't make that much sense. The other thing is, once we're able to get our hands on a 4th Spectre by getting a +2 level minion helmet and a +1 minion level shield, we get a 4th Spectre. This 4th Spectre should then be the Host Chieftain, which in the League Start version doesn't really make that much sense. In terms of gear, we upgraded Severed in Sleep to United in a Dream. As I mentioned earlier, this is our best in slot weapon, for the most part because of the level 25 Envy, which is an aura skill that adds flat chaos damage, which we can afford once we invest further into mana reservation efficiency. We also upgraded our Scan of the Loyal to one with these specific double corrupt implicits. It's important to get one with the right colors. We need 3 green sockets, 2 red sockets, 1 blue socket, or 3 green sockets, 2 blue sockets, 1 red socket. Damage difference between these two isn't really that big, so as long as you can get your hands on one of these two, it's going to be fine. We've also started using a Triad script with 4 white sockets, which isn't that important in the League Start version because we're dealing mainly poison damage, and poison damage is already chaos damage. But in the hit-based version, it's important to convert all the physical damage to chaos damage. For the rare items, we're using fractured items that we then roll with essences and modify them further with Eldritch Currency. The exception to that being the jewelry. In case you're wondering how we can make jewelry like this, I've made videos on this specific subject. I'm of course going to leave the link to those videos in the comments below in case you're wondering. Outside of that, the most important difference is probably those 12 passive clusters that we're now using. The most important aspects are the passive skill effect and the minion attack and cast speed modifier. But you can also get defensive modifiers on them, such as maximum energy shield and plus attributes, or in this case intelligence. The other one has some lightning resistance because it was a bit short on that. In general, these clusters are quite expensive. They cost around 20 to 30 divines each, but they're definitely worth it. Utilizing both clusters probably tripled my DPS almost. The first one definitely gave me around 80% to maybe 100% increased damage. So while they're very expensive, they're definitely worth it. I can only recommend getting these clusters so much. Other noteworthy upgrades include the Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flash combination in order to allocate Void Beacon, which is just added damage via minus chaos resistance, and of course some improvements in terms of the gear on our Animate Guardian. We've now relegated Gravebind to the Guardian and combined that with an explodey weapon, in this case a synthesized item with an explosion implicit. If you can't get your hands on one of these, you can use a Shaper influenced one-handed mace. Have to be like eye level 80 or something, if I remember correctly. And you can roll those with fire modifiers more likely, so Scorched Fossils or the Harvest Craft. You should hit the explosion modifier within like 6 or 7 tries, I think. The other upgrade is the Crown of the Tyrant. Just make sure that you actually have one with a white socket before you use them on your Guardian. You can get the white socket from, let's say, Vorachi level 1, right, which is a great way of using that. In terms of skills, the most notable upgrades are the additional auras, specifically Envy, that we're now using. In order to fort all of these auras, we need to invest further into mana reservation efficiency, which we can get from the helmet, and speccing into charisma and reservation efficiency. In order to do that, we of course need an impossible escape that allows us to allocate passives and then radius of supreme ego. This is obviously expensive, but it's definitely worthwhile. And the other source is Champion of the Cause, which we simply anoint on our amulet. This is pretty much it for the endgame version of the build. I use this to clear all the content in the game and make the footage you saw at the beginning of the video. It is possible to take this build even further. You can, in theory at least, get twice the amount of damage. It obviously requires a tremendous amount of currency and time you have to invest into the build. I'm going to leave the min-maxed version to this build in the comments below, in case you're wondering what that might look like, but you definitely don't have to go that far in order to like clear all the content in the game, obviously. If you have any questions or suggestions, you can leave them in the comments below. Hope you liked it, and see you in the next one.